even the past is unpredictable. I believe that's true about us all. And history is always written as a projection of the historian. And I don't, coming out of a war, there's something more compelling about that because there was an enemy. What's interesting now is who am I mad at? You know, the first amoeba that crawled out of the ocean and created human beings eventually. So we don't know what to do when there's nobody to be mad at. As far as individualism, you know, the Second World War created 70 years of prosperity, at least for this country. So I don't have the experience or sense that this will deepen our isolation. I think it makes visible is how lonely and isolated we were before. We were kidding ourselves. Most people on my block don't know the names of the children. That's isolation. The suburbs, I've interviewed people for one of the books. Why did you move to the suburbs? Good schools and safety for my children. How do you find out about your neighbors? This is in Indian Hill.
Right.
And they say, the people who clean my house is the only connection I have with my neighbors. So where were we connected? And so I think that this will wake us up.
The opportunity.
I don't feel any danger. And I have a feeling, I asked a friend of mine, Goode, who, you know, ran a wine business. I don't know what he's doing now. He's trying to sell me wine. And that's a big market. And I said, what's going to happen, Goode? He says, I think people will now eat out to be together. And they won't need a loud music and they won't need haute cuisine. The foodie era will be gone and we'll just go to a market, to a place to be together. And you know, I know David Brooks, and he's one of my heroes, but I don't see this as a dark time ahead. I think the employment situation is going to be a crisis, but we have all the wealth in the world. There's plenty.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things that strikes me with some of Brooks's writing lately, it's been about community and that sense of how do we call upon the spiritual, the emotional, the sense of values that we have. And I think that's where his hopefulness is that we will respond in those ways. And he cites healthcare workers as people that we honor and model in times like this, and who can lead us to that sense of compassion and sense of community, which they tend to do in times like this. And we take stock of them and we say, you know, that's who we're praying for. That's who we honor in these days. And somehow that leads us to a place of hopefulness and a new way of engaging with our neighbors and with others, because we're all in this together. Like you said, it's like, I don't have anyone to blame. I'm just like my neighbor down. We're all facing these.
See, I think
together.
What I honor the healthcare worker for is the fact they chose healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I honor you for having chosen generosity as a career path, love as a career path. I think it calls us to choose something more purposeful. No matter what your job is, you can find meaning in it, you know. And so I grieve for the healthcare workers because I have the choice to stay home and they don't. And so, of course, they're heroes and better them than soldiers. But
one of the things that, you know, talking about the healthcare workers, that it struck me. I think I was driving down I-75, going down to Fort Thomas last week, and there was a sign up there about, you know, thank you doctors and nurses and so forth. And one of the things that stood out to me, Peter, from what you shared earlier, also even, what I've read, of yours, of your books as well, is the importance of noticing. Do we notice our neighbors? Do we notice our neighbors' children? Do we notice the people who we pass on the street? And in a sense, it's taken something like this for us to notice healthcare workers who, in one sense, are putting themselves on the line every single day.
Every day.
It's not just a coronavirus that is doing that. It's, anytime somebody comes into the hospital with some kind of infectious disease, a nurse, a doctor, a person who cleans the rooms, person who brings the meals, they're all putting themselves out. And so yeah, that to me is a part that speaks to me, is how are we noticing? And I've seen people talking about realizing, oh my gosh, everything that teachers must be doing, because now everybody in a sense is having to do a bit of like at-home schooling. So what's kind of your thoughts about how it is we can notice, be intentional about noticing one another, and even going a step beyond that, that's more than just, oh, they're over there, that's what they do, but honoring, like where do you see how do you see that, of how we can be the very best of ourselves towards that?
You'll only notice what you're connected to.
Mm.
I will notice nothing watching a flat screen. I'll be entertained by a flat screen. I'll be convenienced by a flat screen. I love movies, but I'm a passive participant in a movie theater. And I never met anybody. Everybody in the movie theater turned their backs on me. So I would say, how do we connect? And there's things we all can do now. There's people that have been serving us that are out of work. Why don't we sustain their income if you're serious? I just feel it's hard to notice. I can be mindful, but it's still me being mindful. To me, the underbelly or the vulnerability of the spiritual tradition, it's very individualistic, with some exceptions, like the Mennonites but for most of us, we go into a church and we sit alone, wait for a professional to go to work. Very welcoming at the door. I went to a church in Africa that blew me away because the kitchen was in the front of the building. Most of us put the kitchen in the basement, in the back of the building. Thank you, girls, for serving us. Okay. So I think it is being aware. I think it's also, we view indigenous cultures as if they're undeveloped. There's a guy that said in 1949, Harry Truman said, now that we've prospered as a country, won the war, we're going to help those undeveloped countries. And he was in Mexico, Gustavo, I don't know if you met him when he was here. And he said, I didn't know I was undeveloped until you told me that.
Yeah.
I just thought I lived in Oaxaca. I thought I was Mexican. And so I think, in some ways, these are not poor countries. We're not poor people. To call something poor is to call it broken. So maybe what will raise our attention, our awareness, our noticing things is the playing field may get leveled and Clifton may become a somewhat indigenous community.
Yeah.
Like it is now. I was in India with a friend and I said, how often do you ever eat out often? And he says, oh yeah, we do. We go at least 2 or 3 times a year. Now, he's always had 10 people in his house during dinner. And so I think there's some flavor of that, as we've got to change our mind about what's progress, what's well off. So maybe this will shrink the dollar and open our hearts. I don't know. I
Mm.
just feel if I want to feel connected, I have to know who you are. You know, we have to walk.
Yeah.
You know, that's one of,
I think maybe in play, not as an expression of optimism, but maybe, you know, there is a remembering.
Mhm. It's been interesting for me in our deal at Fleming Road, because one of the things that people have said is that, especially folks that have been able to get on to, we set up phone calls, Zoom calls. This is not a reflection on those churches that want to do a recording and do a presentation on Sunday mornings, but we've opted not to do that. We just do a Zoom call and we have conversations. We don't even call it a worship service. It's a sermon conversation. And what has been fascinating as we've been doing these things is that people have been saying we are actually becoming closer as a church than we were before. And I know that there's a lot of folks who are saying now a lot of churches that are struggling aren't going to survive this stay at home. But one of the things that's been kind of growing within our congregation and within our neighborhood is that the church will not only survive, but thrive during this time. Like we've used the conversation around we're in a wilderness, and we're, you know, just as the Israelites form new practices in the wilderness, we're forming new practices. And a lot of it based on the work that we've done before around asset-based community development. I mean, that language is becoming more real to people, even in a time where they're not in a room together. They're not able to be in a triad together. You know, it's
You,
like,
you break them into small groups.
I need to figure that out on the Zoom technology. I'm still learning. I'll have to get my friend Ed
Are you
to
kidding?
show me how to do it.
Are you the host here?
I am the host.
Come on, baby. I'll show you right now. Okay.
We'll have a tutorial.
Anyway, you know, you say
Kneel at the feet of the master.
He is the bishop.
see, all that was true before, though.
That's true. Yes.
The church, you know, the churches, you know, now, not all churches, but it was true before. And I think it makes you, I would call it a worship service,
Mm-hmm.
because instead of finding God through your sermon, maybe they'll find God in each other's eyes.
That's becoming more and more true. I don't know if they ever found God through my sermons, but yeah, through the relationships.
I want that from you.
Yep. Yeah, that's
You're a
true.
father. You know, you did, you know. And so I would call it worship.
Yeah, I think one element that I'd say needs to be also a part of that is, and you call it worship. I saw music and the arts. How are we including music and the arts when we gather together? And oftentimes it is in worship that people say that's when we do it. Well, there's other ways to have music and art and creativity be a part of those gatherings. So conversation, relating, but also in that, how do we use the best of our traditions that lift spirit, speak spirit, are soulful? Because we've had people in our congregation, when they hear our organist play familiar songs, there's a wonderful hymn, Morning Cry. Are you guys familiar with Morning Cry in our tradition? It's beautiful song, and it speaks of connectedness and neighbor and community, but it is through the music, and that, to me, that's worship. So it's both that vertical and horizontal, whatever, you know.
That's beautiful, you know, because I think arts, culture, music are prophetic. They take you to another place. I think the fact we needed you as my pastor to do that, it was, always puzzled me. Why do you go to that church? I love the sermon. Well, how long is the sermon? 20 minutes. Wow. I once was asked to substitute at New Thought Unity. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? You know, because the sermon was March and they're on vacation or something. And they said, just be done by 5 minutes to 12. You know, it's like, that was but so I think you're right. The music, and you can't argue about the music. You don't need translation for the music or for art. And I think the church almost has survived because of that. And the buildings, I always, and why not make that the point of why we gather? And it's beautiful music. It's not just, well, let's all sing together, which is beautiful also. But I think what you said is very true, and it's prophetic. Maybe our future will be organized around music instead of the mall. I went to Prague years ago, and Prague was one of the only cities in Europe that wasn't bombed. And there was some kind of agreement about it. And every church had a music event at 10, 12, 2, 4, 7 at night. And I thought, oh my God, they haven't forgotten. You certainly
I was actually having a conversation with somebody earlier today about art and wondering what art will come out of this time. What books are being written right now, what paintings are being made, and what will that speak of this time, and then what will that say 5 years, 50 years, 100 years from now?
That's a great question. Who was it? Oscar Monk was a painter, I think, in around 1918, 20, that era you're talking about. And his painting was that of a scream. Oh, yeah. It's called The Scream. And somebody later said, well, that captured the age of anxiety. Okay, to me, this is the age of isolation. And it was and is. And something about that. The three of you are burdened with faith and optimism. Something better will come. But that's I think the arts is something very powerful. And I think the reparations for the African-American community, which in Cincinnati we just have to deal with, because we have such a great history, will come through the arts, the Black arts culture. It won't come from conversations on racism. And it won't come from angry demands for powerful people to do something. That's been futile, really futile. I also have been reading about the real estate cartel and how much our lives is shaped by realtor, and they call it the real estate state, and all the displacement that's occurring in this city. And College Hill now is having a bit of a resurgence, and which means that I'm not saying it's a good thing, it's just that rents are going up. But that's the mindset. So maybe this will question that mindset and say maybe the land should be common land. What I would want is to develop and say this land shouldn't be a commodity for speculation. The land should be reclaimed by us. And let it be a community land trust, and then there's all kinds of ways. So all these things, I think, could come into question. And maybe what the three of you do is what the artists will write about. Let me ask the three of you, each of you, what do you feel is called? What are you called upon at this moment in time? What's the demand on you? What is the world or God or whoever asking of you right now?
So for me, there's two parts of it. One is I do think there's, just in terms of my role as pastor of a congregation, is to be one who is helping to keep people as connected as possible in this, and somewhat, well, not just somewhat, beginning to set up things that may very well and hopefully will continue, but also blossom in new ways beyond this. On a personal side is one of the things that I feel God has moved me towards in my own journey is to be seeking out and sharing beauty. And right now we have an opportunity to slow down and to really see, even in the midst of what is for many people an incredibly trying time, from people who are sick and people who are dying and people who've lost jobs and everything that has gone with that, that there is still the beauty in the world that is around us, and that can sustain us, that can unify us, that can connect us. So as a photographer, that's part of what I use my art towards, is really trying to lift up and share that beauty and helping people discover that for themselves. So I have it on two levels. Yes, the organizational side of it that I'm a part of. But even more so for me is that personal of what I feel like I've been uniquely gifted to do and to be in this world.
Well, as an artist, it's all about seeing,
Mhm.
especially
Yep.
a photographer.
Yeah. And as an Enneagram 5, I'm the observer, so I'm all about seeing things.
Yeah. And I would say there's no separation between you and what your institution does.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Your commitment to art and aesthetic is for the sake of the community.
Yes, indeed.
Enjoy it. That's a fringe benefit, but that doesn't. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Peter. It got me thinking. For me, my mentor, similar to what I think you've been for Rich, has always been Henry Marksberry, who's a little bit older than you are, but is kind of seen as the dean of clinical pastoral education. So I was a chaplain for about 10 years in hospice and hospital, and I really feel like I'm being called to exercise some of those skills as healer, as chaplain, because this is a grief moment for all of us. It's like a death. There is a lot of things about our culture and who we are that are dying. And part of my call is to be with people in that and to help walk that journey, and knowing that in that grief and in that loss and sorrow, there will come a new creation, something different, something healing. I'm hoping healing, bring healing into that, but something beyond this grief. And it will not last forever, but it will be a hard season of grief. And anyone who does grief work knows that it really never ends. The death of a loved one will always be with us. And so the death of whatever's happening in our own personal lives right now will be with us, but we learn to cope and to move on and incorporate it into our existence. And like I think all of us have said, and Peter, you said several times, is that maybe we're letting go of some things that, probably should have let go of a while back, or making aware of things that have always been there maybe, and we're finally just seeing it. And that's what grief does. That's what a loss does. It's like, oh shit, this is what I'm dealing with in life. And it's been there a long time. That's kind of what
Thank you.
my response to your.
It's beautiful what you said. And I think grief is an action step. It leads to nothing. It's an end in itself. A friend of mine, Peter Kestenbaum, he says, we're wounded at the moment of birth. And I love the fact that grief will enter our life as an alternative to the pursuit of happiness, consumer culture. And, yoga has been one of my solaces, especially now that I can just go downstairs and do it. And the last act of Shavasana is called the death of the practice. And I love the intentionality of that. The last thing we do is lie quietly for 5 or 6 minutes. without moving, so that we can see the restorative nature of grief, and to have you next to me, not encouraging me to feel better or promising me a future you can't deliver. Okay, and save me from your optimism. But just to have you next to me in my suffering and grief and the letting go, that's a beautiful thing.
Wow. Well, I think that's beautiful. Well, I think for me, I think during this season, what I'm being called to is to let my hair grow out really long. That's the first thing.
What's that represent?
I don't know.
Wild
If you did
man.
know, what would it be? Oh my God, this guy is so silly.
I don't know. It's been an interesting piece. But I've got people in my choir, ladies in my choir, that are telling me I need to grow it out even longer. So we'll see what that means. So, other than that, and actually there is a private. I don't know. Maybe it's just a new season that I find myself in.
I think it's you letting go, Rich.
Yes.
The softening of your demeanor and the softening of your look.
Yeah.
And it's not quite as together. You're a little more raggedy than you were.
That's true. And you and I have talked a lot about this, but I think it's part of, like, I love your comment. I think for me, where I'm at in the depth of who I am is that depth of optimism and moving in from hope to faith, which is a deeper word, as we've talked about over the years of I don't know, a deeper flow at work that's within me that's kind of revealing more of that true self. I think within that, it's been very freeing within our church during this season to move away from the commodity of church, like what we try to present, and actually be in conversation. We say all the time, we get on these Zoom conversations, it's not perfect, it's not even good TV by any stretch of the imagination, but we're having conversations and we're sharing life together. And we did that before, you're right. And I think that actually has given people strength during this time to kind of understand in a deeper way that we're no longer a commodity, but we are a communion, a coming together in union, a community, and placed within a larger context of a community, of a neighborhood, and how we relate to that. I mean, and in the midst of that, those conversations, finding out deeper things about ourselves as we let go of things. We talked a lot about in our group, our common good group that still meets. We've been talking about lament, and lament that's something that the church doesn't do very well at times. We race, like, this is Holy Week, right? I mean, this is a week about death, and we want to race to Sunday, but we don't want to deal with Friday. And we have to deal with the lament. I mean, that's the Easter message for me. It's like, when Jesus is on the cross and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, he's lost. And the good news for me is that he's lost with me, I'm lost. And as we die together, it's okay. Something else comes out of that, but it's okay. So
it's like surrendering to the inevitable.
Yeah.
Death is not a problem to be solved.
Mm-mm.
And part of our alienation from each other is a denial of death.
Or fear.
Well, it's a marketed fear. We consider death to be a medical failure.
Yeah.
And so I've been sold the idea that I should live long, and I wonder what has science given me. Life expectancy is about it. And a little bit of health, it hasn't made us love each other anymore, that I can tell.
We're glad you're still here, though, Peter.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm here for no good reason. I'll take it.
That's not true. You're here for a lot of good reasons.
It's strange to me that I've been able to commit myself to this quarantine, because I tend to be disrespectful of good advice and
Rules.
So how is this conversation going? I love that question, because if I can understand how this conversation is going, I'll know how my life is going. See, the other powerful thing about the church is you understand the power of a metaphor, a parable, a story.
Yeah.
I've always felt, you talk about paying attention. Well, I always ask people, why was it important for you to be here today? Because if I can answer that, then I know why I'm alive. And I would say what I want, one of the things I want from you, having made this commitment to faith, is to help me and the world understand why we were alive and why we're born. And that's a tough one.
Yeah. Well, I would say, to answer the question how this conversation is going, it's going like any of our other conversations. It takes twists and turns, but in the midst of it, there's just so much beauty, because more than the words that are being shared, but just the connecting points. I mean, Dan and Ed are good friends of mine, and we've all, have had these different opportunities together, and you and I have had opportunities together, and where we've shared a lot of life together. And then we come to this time and moment where culture is, everything's a startup. Everything is new in some ways. And yet some of the principles of relationship, of community, of belonging keep us in covenant, anchored. I mean, I'm thinking of some of Walter's words, relational fidelity.
Yeah.
And then that kind of creates this beautiful ground to when we get in these conversations, something kind of that we've cultivated before grows. I know, Ed just sent me a text about, your conversation around grief and how that really hit him and making him think of some other things.
I also, one of the dark sides of the church has been its promise of certainty.
Yep. Amen to that.
That promise has been stolen from.
Yeah. I've fought that a lot in the ministry, and a lot of it comes from my dealing with hospice patients and people wanting certainty, and I kind of refrain from that, and especially, I don't know. Yvette Flunder once said, "I don't know. You know when you don't know." It's like, I don't know. And people want certainty from their pastors. They want certainty from their churches. And it's very, very seductive. And we can give that to them and think, oh, we're doing our job. I think we're far away from doing our job and justice to life and whatever we call God or mystery or holiness, whatever you want to call it. We don't live into that reality when we try to control it and say we know the certainty or whatever. It's like, I think we do a disservice to our congregants, to our community.
I agree. I think to promise or to stand in certainty is an act of betrayal.
Yeah.
And I think I don't know is a leadership position. It's not a confession or an apology. What's going to happen to me, Father? Where am I headed? Will I get better? You look them in the eye with love and say, I don't know.
Yeah, her exact quote is, when you know you don't know, you know. I think it's something like that. Yvette Flunder, if you're familiar with Leslie Jones, guys, it's one of her heroes.
Yeah. That's as good as it gets.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things that this pandemic, because, as we've been meeting with our leadership team here at the church, and when we make all these plans, and I keep on saying, and other people are saying the same thing, it's not just me, there's one thing that we are certain of, and that's that we don't know what's going to happen next. And so it's actually one of those things of where every day we learn something new about this pandemic, about what's going on in our neighborhood, And it actually has, I think in some ways, made that conversation around life in general, the uncertainty of life, become more real. And I can't remember how Walter put it, when we were at that thing with Parish Collective at your place, Peter, and he said, the whole idea, it's relational fidelity. I mean, certainty, like God never promised certainty. God promised God's self, or promised relational
Talks
fidelity.
about covenant
Yeah, it's all wrapped around covenant.
versus contract.
Yes.
But see, we never knew what was in the future. Just
Right.
because I know we're going to have a Memorial Day parade don't mean shit.
Yeah, exactly.
You taking that from me? What else is left? Well, everything the three of you are saying is what's left. And it's enough. That's what makes what you're doing so relevant now, just in the stance that you're taking. And people say, well, what are you doing about the pandemic? And you say, well, I'm helping myself and my congregation experience it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so amazing. Some people, all they have is a plan. And it's been stolen from all of us.
Yep.
How long will it last?
Yeah.
I don't know. And some places have boarded themselves up in fear of violence.
Yeah.
Where is that? I don't see it. So who did we think we were? It's really pretty stunning. I'm kind of lucky to be around for it. And in some ways, the streets are empty and the homeless are better taken care of.
Yeah, that's true.
That mean they're now renting hotels for homeless people to stay in. So it's provoked enormous amount of forgiveness. Even debts are forgiven. Banks are softening their edges. Landlords. So what I want is an eternal pandemic with nobody getting sick.
Yeah.
That's the covenant that we should go into the streets for. So we want to live just like this, with a few exceptions of being in the physical presence of other human beings, in small places that don't cost a lot. Mm-hmm. But everything else you can have. It's just I don't want anybody to be sick. And we'll find work for the others.
Yeah. Well, you may get that wish, because I heard this morning that we may be in some sort of state of shelter order up through October.
Don't you love it? What happened to the news?
I don't know if that's true or not, but I mean, it was.
I just
from a reliable source. So
yeah, I heard August. So yeah.
Thank you for what you guys do and for the care. My daughter is a hospice educator, a Zen Buddhist, and so I'm familiar, Dan, with the world that you've chosen to be close to.
Yeah.
People go crazy. She was a hospital chaplain for a while. One family, as the mother was dying, it just brought out all the unfinished business of the family. They ended up in the emergency room because they actually got into a fight with each other.
Yep.
It just tells you how unprepared we are for death. And it's great work. I'd like to see your photography. It'd be fun.
he does have a class that he does down at the Hive on photography.
Yep. We have one. It's going to be on Zoom starting in May.
Awesome. I love it. I love the arts. Is the only thing I buy that I've ever cared about. It's my room. And I've been finishing my business because through the years, I only started when I was in my 40s. I always saw pieces I loved, but I didn't have the nerve to buy. It takes courage to buy art that you care about. And so the last years I've been trying to complete my life by going back and finding the artists that I never had the nerve to buy because they were too expensive. And now nobody gives a shit about art, so they're not so expensive. I've got a piece here, this snake dance right there.
Ooh.
And I saw that in 1984, and I didn't have the nerve to spend $2,200 on it because it would have made me broke. And about 4 months ago, it came up for auction. I thought God was speaking to me. And there's something about the art and the arts and photography and all of that that's just means the world.
That's awesome. Well, hey, we are coming up to our hour here. And I just want to respect that. I know we had said that we would meet for about an hour, but can I, I'm going to take something that I've learned from Peter over the years, maybe to end this. But before we end it, actually, Ed has a poem that he wanted to read that kind of hit on some of the words that Peter was saying earlier. And so maybe in a minute, Ed, if you want to read that poem, and then at the end, taking it from the Peter Block playbook, share one thing about this conversation. Just one thing, like one sentence, two sentences, that meant something to you. That sound good?
So let's say
Sounds
it
good.
first and then end with with the sacred, which is a poem.
We can do that. Hey, you're the bishop, man.
Well, for me, I wrote down, I wrote Peter said, we only notice that which we are connected to. Yeah, that's my one thing.
Well, I think I would take away from this just the sense of the joy of being connected before, the joy of being connected in the now, and the joy of being connected after this, and how all of us continue to be in this life together. And so, and I would also take away just the comments around grief and just being reminded again to let optimism pass.
For me, just Peter, getting to see who you are and hear from you is a blessing. So I thank you. Your presence is very much appreciated, and your words, your wisdom, and encouragement. Really, very thankful for that. So I'm glad to have met you and glad to meet you, and look forward to the future. And Ed and Rich, always good to be with you.
And I thank you, Dan. It's I appreciate your friendship with each other and your willingness to share with the world. And one of the things that this moment also does is it's not based on scale.
Mm-hmm.
Suppose there's 3 people. I've always felt that way. How many people showed up. I thought that was always the wrong question. But who knows how you, in a moment you never knew, you touched somebody's life. And so the fact you're doing this together is the church. And the other thing, in addition to your thoughtfulness, is that actually it's just time to reflect. I mean, it's so nice to have a chance to think about things. And you kind of put doing aside, other than keeping the smoker at 210 degrees. No, just the fact that you come as a space for reflection and thought, and the instinct to share it. And that's healing. That's real healing. Not the laying on of hands. It's the chance that I get to know how you think about the world and what you do in the world. A great gift to me. And you, Rich, is a good friend. So let's hear the poem.
Okay, so it comes out of a book called The Words of Her Mouth. It's a collection of poems inspired by the Psalms, and it's been my companion since we entered into this. And this poem was based on Psalm 13. And verse 2 of Psalm 13 says, "How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long?" And the poem is written by a woman named Julia Seymour called Grief. And it spoke to me as Peter talked about that journey of grief, but also talking about the nature of us needing to be connected. The cycles of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance are idols. They are mile markers on a highway I am not traveling. In my pain, I am not on a clearly marked trail, but bushwhacking through brush, crossing unknown rivers, backtracking and circling to see the same places again and again. These alleged compass points, meant to show progress in my journey, are only useful if they're printed on a handkerchief. And then I wipe my face with them and see more clearly. I call out and I can hear a chorus of false friends with easy platitudes, but they don't know this terrain. Only when I glimpse the shadows of fellow travelers on their own trails, when I hear the birds and watch squirrels jump, when the water is clean and clear and full of life, then I remember I am not alone. Everything is still hard, but I remember I'm not alone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Ed. It's amazing. That's what I call an action plan.
Well, friends, thank you again. Go in peace. Let optimism go by its way, and let faith and friendship and connection continue to grow. Love to all.
Amen.